I hope it wasn't too hard to find a place to park. We should have reserved parking space for our Monday meetings, considering. Okay, so please turn your cell phones off as usual, and make sure you sign the attendance sheet. I'd like to make just a couple of announcements to start with. As you know, we don't have class next Monday, President's Day. So the next class will be held on Monday, February 24th. Also, a reminder those who might be interested or who are new to this class is that on Wednesday, February 19th, which is not this Wednesday, the following one, we resume also our program of occasional talks, which we hold at the smaller branch of the public library on Bellevue, and which will be held as the usual time, 7 p.m. From 7 to 8:30, during which we'll be addressing the immigration issue in the Americas, not only North America, but in general on the southern hemisphere as well. All right, today, however, as I told you last week, we are going to take a look at the long-awaited peace plan for the Middle East called Vision for Peace, which was promised by Donald Trump at the start of his presidency back in January 2017, and which was finally unveiled some 10 days ago, 3 years later, on the occasion of a visit to Washington by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and the chief of the main opposition party in Israel, Benny Gantz. Noticeably absent from this ceremony of announcement was a Palestinian delegation that had rejected the invitation. However, 3 Arab countries, 3 Arab ambassadors were present at the ceremony, those of the United Arab Emirates, of Oman, and of Qatar. Now, without going into all the way back to the origins of the Arab-Israeli conflict, let me say that for the past 70 years, basically since the establishment of the Jewish state, and throughout the 4 wars, Arab-Israeli wars, of 48, 56, 67, and 73, I'm not counting the 2 so-called wars in the 2000 against, because they are not against Arab countries, they were against Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in Gaza. The prevailing thinking among Middle East experts and negotiators was that the best way to stabilize the Middle East was by constraining Israel to give back at the negotiating table what it has taken on the battlefield. The so-called land for peace or peace for land formula. The case in point is the famous Security Council Resolution 242 adopted by the UN in 1967 after the Israeli-Arab conflict, calling for the withdrawal from occupied territories in exchange of the termination of states of belligerency between the parties. Now, this resolution is famous because deliberately is ambivalent and vague. It speaks of occupied territories without specifically mentioning what territories and how many. So obviously it has been subject to interpretation ever since. For the Israeli side, occupied territories means some of them would be returned to the Arabs, and some of them will be annexed and incorporated into Israel. For the Arab side, occupied territories meant all the territories that Israel took over in 1967, after the 67 war. That was the prevailing thinking, that in order to achieve peace, Israel had to return territories to the Arab country, and in exchange, it would be recognized as a state in the Middle East. Over time, however, Israel has grown to become a regional power with a thriving economy and a fearsome military backed by nuclear weapons, and thus more able to resist external pressure and make its own decisions as to what to keep and what to give back. As an example, ever since Israel gave back to the other side certain areas in southern Lebanon called the Shaba Farms, a small part of in southern Lebanon, but that went to Hezbollah. It gave back Gaza to the Palestinians to rule, and certain areas in the West Bank, which also are administered by the Palestinian Authority. And it kept also a number of areas in the West Bank, but we'll come back to that, as well as East Jerusalem in particular. Concomitantly, the Palestinian cause, one of the very rare issues that had united Arab countries across the Middle East, diminished in importance. As some Arab leaders turned their focus inward to domestic security and economic problems, such as Egypt or Jordan, while other Arab countries, like Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries, have come to see Iran as the greatest threat for the region, and Israel as a potential ally against it. As for the Palestinians themselves, they remain impoverished members of the international community, and with all they had to offer was threats of terror. That was their chief negotiating tool. So I'm just trying to give you the context the political context, the geopolitical context in which President Trump vowed to come up with a bigger and better deal to broker peace between Israel and the Palestinians. As you know, he assigned the project to a trio composed of Jared Kushner, his son-in-law and senior advisor, to Jason Greenblatt, who was the special U.S. envoy for the Middle East. I say he was because he recently resigned that position. And David Friedman, who is the U.S. ambassador to Israel. The three men worked closely over 3 years with some actors in the region, particularly Israel, and a few Arab allies, including Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates and Jordan, with no input whatsoever from the Palestinians, who had cut off all relations with Washington in 2017 after the US recognized Israel's sovereignty over the whole city of Jerusalem. Well, let's see now what the main features of this 181-page plan are. The first observation is that the whole concept of this plan is a sharp departure from decades of American policy in the region. Indeed, the United States had long advocated support for the creation of a Palestinian state alongside Israel, the so-called two-state solution, with only slight adjustments to the Israeli boundaries that existed before the 1967 Arab-Israeli War, when, as you know, Israel wrestled the West Bank from Jordan and Gaza from Egypt. Past administrations considered having Israel annex the main settlements which were situated along the 67 border between Israel and the West Bank, so long as the Palestinians received equivalent land from Israel to compensate. Unfortunately, I couldn't print names on it, but just to give you a few ideas, this is Gaza here, Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, the West Bank, Jordan, right here, Dead Sea, and this is your map, and this is what it looks today. These are the Israeli settlements in red. So that's all these red spots. So, so you see. So what I was saying is that in previous negotiations, the idea was, again, for Israel to annex. This is Israel, proper. This is the West Bank. This is Jerusalem. The idea was for Israel to annex some of the settlements on the border between Israel proper and the West Bank, and in exchange, the Palestinians would have received some land in the West Bank to compensate. And how would they receive that land? These are the Israeli settlements which are close to Israel proper. And these are the Israeli settlements which were created in the heart of the West Bank. So the previous plans, what was supposed to be happening is that 85% of the settlers in the West Bank would have been absorbed into Israel, since the settlements, the Jewish settlements, would have become part of Israel. However, the outlying settlements, which are further east in the West Bank, region that actually Israel refers to by its biblical term of Judea and Samaria, would have been evacuated to allow for a contiguous Palestinian state eventually. So in other words, Israel would have kept some of the settlements here, which are closer to Israel proper, and evacuate some of the settlements which are closer to Jordan, in the heart of the West Bank. So 15% of the Jewish settlers in those areas would have been evacuated back to Israel, because that would have become part of the Palestinian state. So the Palestinian state would have been contiguous. They could have traveled freely from one area to the other. Now, Trump's peace plan adopts the idea of land swaps, but with a twist. It offers Palestinians to compensate for the incorporation of the West Bank settlement into Israel, as I said earlier. Settlements, by the way, all of them, which are considered illegal by the United Nations and the other countries, and which should be subjected to direct negotiation between the parties. But this land would not be in the West Bank, but alongside an arid region with Egypt. Here. Now, the results would be threefold. First, it would ensure that an eventual Palestinian state would have no territorial contiguity. In other words, in the middle of the Palestinian state, you would have all the Jewish settlements. To make up for it, the Trump plan proposes transportational contiguity through tunnels and bridges that would connect different parts of an eventual Palestinian state. Tunnels and bridges, actually, that would be under Israeli control. Second, this arrangement would mean for the Palestinians to give up around 30% of the West Bank land, where Israel has built settlements over the past 50 years. And third, it was established for the first time a permanent eastern border for Israel along the Jordan River. Right here, which, as you can see, is occupied by Israel at this time. So, in other words, the Palestinian state, if it ever ceased today, would be surrounded by Israel and landlocked. And ensure that Israel would never have to leave places like Hebron, for instance, This is the first main feature of the plan. As regards to the hypersensitive issue of Jerusalem, there are two components: the so-called real estate component and the religious component, which actually in Jerusalem are closely linked, as you're going to see. The general assumption before this plan had been that in the context of a peace negotiation, the Arab suburbs of East Jerusalem should come under Palestinian sovereignty, and the Jewish suburbs should come under Israel's sovereignty. Instead, the Trump's plan puts almost all of East Jerusalem and its Arab suburbs under Israeli sovereignty, leaving to the Palestinians as a possible capital one Arab suburb, a small village which is on the outskirts of Jerusalem called Abu Dis. Which is here. This is West Jerusalem, which is under Israeli sovereignty. West East Jerusalem, which is occupied by Israel and now has become part of Jerusalem, part of it. And this is Abu Dis right here. Now, the problem with Abu Dis is that it is cut off from the esplanade of the mosque, and we're going to get there, which is one of the most sacred sites of Islam. It's cut off from the Al-Aqsa Mosque and from the 300,000 Palestinian residents who live in East Jerusalem. It's cut off by Israel's security barrier. As for the religious component, previous negotiations had tried to reconcile the competing claims to sovereignty over the city, particularly in the what I call the Holy Basin, that encompasses the Old City and the Christian, Muslim, and Jewish holy sites therein. Previous negotiation had tried to resolve the sovereignty issue by proposing joint governance of the Old City. The Trump team instead resolved the matter by granting Israel sovereignty over the entire area, including the Christian and Muslim quarters. This is basically right here, what I call the Holy Basin, and we'll come back. Let me give you some background on this area. For the past 53 years, in other words, after the takeover by Israel of East Jerusalem after the 1967 war, they took it, Israel took it back from Jordan. Jews had access again, because they, under Jordanian sovereignty, they could not access to that area. Had access again to the site known as Esplanade of the Mosque, or which is known as Temple Mount to the Jews, and Haram al-Sharif to Muslims, where are located some of the, as I mentioned, some of the most sacred sites for both religions, for the Christian religion as well, but this is not our, it's irrelevant for our, to our subject here. It has the Western Wall, which is also called, known as the Wailing Wall, right here, positive, as well as the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the largest mosque in Jerusalem, and the Dome of the Rock. These two sites are the third most sacred site in the Muslim, for the Muslim pilgrims to visit once in a lifetime after Mecca and Medina. Because of the obvious religious sensitivities, successive Israeli governments have, as a matter of policy, allowed only Muslims to pray there. Visitors of other faiths are allowed to visit, but they cannot pray. Only Jews, obviously, they pray. Jewish visitors can pray at the Western Wall, obviously. And they, sorry? Which? To unlimited? It's limited. I don't know about that. Anyway, thank you for the correction. That being said, the Muslim sites are placed under the authority of an Islamic council under Jordanian custodianship. The Trump plan commits to maintaining the status quo, but also provides from Jewish prayer on the Esplanade, not only at the Wailing Wall, which might turn out to be an inflammatory move. As compensation, the Palestinians are offered a tourist center north of Jerusalem and Israeli-controlled access from there to the Muslim and Christian holy sites. This is a sort of offer that the former president of the Palestinian Authority, Yasser Arafat, who's dead now, turned down at Camp David back in 2000, telling President Clinton at the time that if he accepted this offer, he would not wait, he wouldn't wait for his people to kill him. He would rather kill himself. And now, finally, from a political point of view, in order to qualify for statehood, the Palestinian Authority would have to reach a number of benchmarks in exchange for American and Israeli recognition as a demilitarized Palestinian state, including implementation of a certain number of Western democratic values and norms, and also retaking control of Gaza and disarming the Hamas militia there, something that the Palestinian Authority is in no position to do today. Now, that we saw the main components of the plan, let's see the different reactions to it. Predictably, the Palestinians reacted with anger on the streets of Gaza and in some cities on the West Bank. Protests broke out spontaneously. And last week, several incidents in the West Bank caused a few casualties. However, by and large, there was no mass demonstrations, nor threat of specific action, and little to suggest that the relationship between Israel and the Palestinians would fundamentally change. Despite the fact that in its present form, the plan deprives Palestinians of nearly everything that they had fought for. East Jerusalem as their national capital, the removal of Jewish settlements on the West Bank, and territorial contiguity and control over its borders and security. Mahmoud Abbas, the 84-year-old leader of the Palestinian Authority, denounced the plan, calling it a conspiracy not worthy of serious consideration. We say 1,000 times over, no, no, and no, he said, speaking from his headquarters in Ramallah on the West Bank. But in truth, his rejection carries very little weight. As a struggling Palestinian economy, a deeply divided political leadership, as you know, the Palestinian Authority that rules in part of the West Bank, and Hamas, which rules in Gaza, do not see eye to eye on almost anything, as well as widespread corruption among the Palestinian leaders, which increase the mistrust of the Palestinian population in their leadership. Years of diplomatic failure with Israel, the total absence of communication with the Trump administration since 2017, and the shifting of the Arab political landscape, in which the Palestinian issue took a backseat. All these elements combined contributed to leave the Palestinian Authority, the Palestinians in general, and the Palestinian Authority in particular, with few good options. One option advocated by a number of Palestinian leaders was the immediate ending of the Israeli-Palestinian security cooperation in the West Bank that had helped somewhat, contributed somewhat to protect the Israeli civilians and the Israeli population for terror acts, but which is seen by many Palestinians as an act of collaboration with the enemy. Abbas, however, resists that move because the cooperation with Israel also ensure his political survival by keeping away Hamas, that has chased the Palestinian Authority out of Gaza in 2006 and challenges Abbas's authority ever since. Other Palestinians suggested breaking up altogether the Palestinian Authority, forcing Israel to take on the cost of health, education, social welfare of the West Bank and its 2.5 million Palestinians. That proposal was also immediately rejected by Abbas, since the Palestinian Authority is keen on continuing administering even parts of the West Bank, and is unwilling to allow Israel to return to the role of occupying power. In addition, I don't believe that Israel would like that very much, to have, again, to administer so many Palestinians in the West Bank. The third option, the resumption of the armed resistance or intifada, is really not an option in today's political landscape, considering that the Palestinian grassroots have been weakened over time, not just by Israel, but also by the Palestinian Authority and Hamas's own repression, since protesters against the Israeli occupation also sometimes protest against autocracy and corruption, the corruption of its own leaders. What most Palestinians agree on at this point is the idea that just merely staying on that land is in itself an act of resistance. Patience is also urged by Abbas, who is largely driven by self-preservation. After all, he's entering the 16th year of what was supposed to be a 4-year term as head of the Palestinian Authority. The aging Palestinian leader believes that the safest way for him is to try to weather the storm, hoping that Trump is not re-elected in November and that Netanyahu loses his position even sooner. He also banks on the fact that the peace plan calls for a 4-year freeze of constructions of new Jewish settlements in the West Bank that might give him enough time to revisit the whole deal. In the meantime, he announced last week that he would bring this plan before the UN Security Council sometime this week or next, knowing perfectly well that any resolution going against the grain of the American plan would be vetoed by the United States in the Security Council, and that any probable condemnation of Israel, which is almost automatic in the General Assembly that regroups all the UN member states, would be toothless, since it's not enforceable. So let's see how the other parties reacted. In the Arab world, despite a recent public statement issued by the Arab League protesting what is considered the partial nature of the plan, the reaction was lukewarm, with none of the US regional allies formally endorsing or outright rejecting the plan. For instance, the Foreign Ministry of Egypt, which is the first country to have signed a peace treaty with Israel, issued a vague statement praising President Trump's efforts to reach an agreement and urging, as usual, both sides to resume talks that might eventually restore to Palestinians their full rights. Jordan, the other American ally in the region to have reached a peace treaty with Israel, effectively ignored President Trump's peace plan and restated its commitment again to many of the Palestinian demands which were disregarded in the Trump plan, such as a Palestinian state with East Jerusalem as capital. Saudi Arabia welcomed President Trump's effort without endorsing the plan. The kingdom also stuck to its long-standing stance that negotiations should lead to an agreement that achieves legitimate rights of the Palestinian people. Now, in Israel, Prime Minister Netanyahu, who's fighting for his political survival after being charged in 3 corruption cases, could only welcome the unveiling of this plan at this time. I remind you that there are new parliamentary elections in Israel scheduled in 3 weeks, 3 weeks from now on, March 2nd. The plan not only offers him the possibility of claiming an historic victory back home and the hope to win this 3rd election decisively this time, but also as a result of a win, of a possible win, to obtain immunity from prosecution. He did not waste any time, actually, by announcing his intention to have his cabinet endorse immediately Israel's sovereignty over all Jewish settlement in the West Bank, but was dissuaded by Washington, that reminded him that the current Israeli government, which he leads, is only a caretaker, and as such could not make that type of decision until after the elections. And finally, having seen this plan, one can wonder what were the motivations, the administration's motivations behind it. One of them stems from the growing belief in Washington that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict can no longer, in fact, be solved with a 2-state solution. It might once have been the case, and countless rounds of negotiations over half a century tried everything they could to bring it off. But it seems that the opportunity passed. Recent polling actually indicates that a growing number of Israelis and Palestinians share this American skepticism. It is not obvious how the United States should deal with this new reality. And the Trump administration's approach to solve the problem may not or may be successful. But this is a huge question mark. Unlike his predecessors, however, the president looks at the Middle East like any other region, take into consideration the geopolitical reality on the ground. He can see that Israel, having conquered the staging areas its enemies regularly used to attack it, will never give all of them back. His peace plan reflects and formalizes, in a way, that reality. This might advance U.S. interests effectively in the long run, or it may not. But to just brush the whole plan aside as unwise, especially when compared to the failures of previous administrations to jumpstart peace talks between the parties, is unfair. That being said, it is also true that the plan's obvious imbalance as a starting point for negotiations, because these are, let's not forget, these provisions cannot be imposed. These are just mere proposals. And for beginning of negotiations between the parties. Well, this imbalance is probably its most glaring weakness. Little wonder if the Palestinians, in a way, look at this plan and wonder, was Jerusalem gone, the settlement annexed, and our future state the shape of a Swiss cheese, then what is there to negotiate? As I said earlier, the Palestinians, though, cannot beat something with nothing. Their outright rejection of the Trump plan will only provide Netanyahu the justification to go ahead and with the annexation. The plan offers the Palestinians instead the opportunity to declare its willingness to enter direct negotiations with a new Israeli government after March 2nd elections, using as a starting point a mixture of elements from the Trump peace plan and from previous UN Security Council resolutions to try and negotiate better terms for a Palestinian state. Now, what are the chances for something like that to happen? I know that we're dealing here with a land of miracles, but even miracles have limits. And I really don't know if this opportunity, because every peace plan, no matter what, and every peace plan has its weaknesses, shortcomings, and but there are also a peace plan is something from which to build on, and even in a negotiation, you never get 100% of what you want. You have to make concessions and to compromise. Now, the real tragedy in the region is that as long as neither side is ready to do that, to compromise, no peace plan has a chance of succeeding, no matter how much external pressure is put on the two parties to come to the negotiating table. So this is where we stand today on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. The peace plan doesn't seem to bring it closer to a resolution, but the question would be, to be fair to this administration, what would? So on this question mark, let's take a break, 5 minutes, and come back. Thank you. Okay. Let's resume again. We're going to pass the microphone around. You deserve it.
Okay, I have two questions. One is that by United Nations ruling, Jerusalem is an international city and demilitarized. Is that totally gone by the wayside and nobody talks about that at all? And my second question is, a couple of weeks ago when Gans was here, you said he left.
Can you speak in the
I'm
closer
sorry.
to?
I'm sorry. A couple of weeks ago when Gans was here in the U.S., he went back because of a Knesset meeting about Netanyahu. What happened at that session?
The first question, nobody talks about Jerusalem status anymore. There is nothing to say. The United States made this unilateral decision back in 2017. As a matter of fact, you might know that every administration had promised in the beginning, the U.S. administration, to take the U.S. embassy out of Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. But none has done it. Trump had promised, and he did it, actually. There is not much to say. I mean, there are a number of countries that follow in his footsteps. Honduras, Guatemala, I think they come to mind, and maybe one or two countries in Eastern Europe who followed them, but basically a majority, a large majority of the what you call international community still does not recognize Jerusalem, the whole of the city of Jerusalem, as capital of Israel. The UN's position being, as you know, that Jerusalem, like the West Bank, and should be subject to negotiations, direct negotiations between the party. The American decision is a unilateral decision, so there is nothing much anybody can do about it, or there is no way of contesting it, because again, if it was discussed actually by the Security Council back when the embassy effectively moved from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, but there was only a discussion, because it was very well known that if a resolution is issued, the U.S. will veto it in the Security Council. So there is not much to say. As for Benny Gantz having to go back to Jerusalem the next day, he didn't have to, because Netanyahu officially stopped contesting the decision of the prosecutor in Israel. So, in other words, he is convicted now, officially, of fraud and corruption in now it has to come. There are still a few steps to be taken. In other words, he has a right to defend himself. So his lawyers have not spoken with the prosecutor. Everybody's waiting for the elections to take place, because as you know, if the Likud, his party, wins the elections in 3 weeks from now, and automatically he becomes prime minister again, then he can. It makes it much easier for him to obtain immunity from prosecution for as long as he's prime minister. So that's another 5 years. If he doesn't win the elections, he might have a way of, I don't know, they might still have to established a coalition government. That's not totally impossible, even though Gantz has said all the time that he would not enter into a coalition with the Likud, with a prime minister who has been who's under accusation of corruption. So let's see what happens after March 2nd, and then we'll have a clearer picture whether Netanyahu can stay on without being prosecuted, or the other party will win, in which case we'll see what happens.
I think in your presentation, you should have included the fact that the Palestinians basically refused to recognize Israel. They had the opportunity at the beginning to sit down with this peace proposal when it was being written. They boycotted. They want no part of it. You indicated that they chose not to come to Washington when it was announced. They basically boycotted it. And for them, to turn around and say, well, we're not happy with the results, you had an opportunity at the beginning. They chose not to participate. There is, as we all know, a history going back of peace accords, Oslo, Camp David, or whatever. So there is precedent, but for lots of reasons, the Palestinians pretty much basically either refuse to recognize or go forward with it. This plan is a basis for negotiations, but you can't negotiate with yourself. The other side has to come to the table and sit down. And as far as Benny Gantz goes, my understanding is that over the last couple of years, with the Israeli elections, the whole land for peace and two-state solution, whatever, was a non-issue. That all the major parties in Israel, Gantz, Netanyahu, and some of the others, they basically are all on the same side. And this was not a campaign issue. The major issue, as you've pointed out, was Netanyahu and his charges of corruption and whatever. That's the big problem there. This, my understanding, is not really. Everybody seems to be agreed on that. But again, coming back to my basic feeling, you can't negotiate with yourself. The other side has to come in. They haven't.
That is so. The other side did not come in. They had the reason. Again, as I told you, I did not want to go back to the origin of the conflict and go through all these accords, which were almost accords, except for Oslo, but they were never implemented, really, because the Palestinian side was never ready to make to compromise on some of the issues, including the one which I did not mention because it wasn't really relevant to the peace plan here, was the question of the refugees. But that's another issue. But what I tried to do here is just present the plan and what the reaction to the plan were, because otherwise it's a broad subject, it's a huge subject, and we won't finish in 1 hour or 50 minutes that I have to present it. It was basically, I tried to explain what the political context for this plan was. And again, unfortunately, as I also mentioned, the feeling on both sides, on the Palestinian side, increasingly, is that the two-state solution is no solution any longer. And that, in a way, is very worrisome because we don't know, nobody knows where that can lead. Obviously, Israel does not wish a country in which, demographically speaking, 20 years from now, with a population, Palestinian population there, 20 to 50 years from now, it would lose its Jewish nature, obviously. Number two, the Palestinians claim that they are 5 million nowadays. Well, they are much less, but let's just put this aside. But just with the number of Palestinians living in the West Bank, if you absorb them into Israel, with the 500,000 plus Palestinians who are Israeli citizens today, that would give you a population of 3.5 million Palestinians for 6 million Jews or something like that. Well, 50 years from now, and considering again the demographic, it wouldn't be a Jewish state anymore. So obviously this is not something that Israel can accept, not only philosophically, but also economically, to incorporate 3 million Palestinians into the Israeli economy. So this goes out the window. So what is left if you don't have a two-state solution? That is a huge question mark for that area, because nobody has come up with any solution that could satisfy both sides, except for a two-state solution. But a two-state solution, what kind of state? Mostly for the Palestinians, what kind of state could they establish in the territories where I have a majority of people? That would satisfy Israel also and its security concerns. And that's also a huge question mark. Because obviously, based on previous experiences in the area, the Palestinians will never achieve their 100% of their of what they want. They might get something, and is this peace plan, Trump's peace plan, is this all they would get? My feeling is that if they came to the table, they might be able to work out somewhat better terms in terms of territory but on the principle itself, like the city of Jerusalem, dividing the city of Jerusalem again as it was prior to the 1967 war, I don't believe so. It's a fait accompli, and Israel is not going to return it to the Palestinians. So if you use it as a pretext not to negotiate, then what are your options? This latent state of war, or not war, but conflict, a wall in between, between the parties. What can be the solution there? And this is a conflict of our times. There is basically, it's almost impossible to resolve as long as basically there are two people vying for the same piece of land, from the same piece of, and this is a very difficult, not only politically speaking, because politically speaking there is always way to adjust or to compromise, but there is a religious factor that comes also into play, and which is extremely by nature emotional, a very emotional factor. And it's when you include religious factors into a political, geopolitical context, it becomes almost impossible to resolve. And that's where we stand after, 75 years, but basically since the inception of Israel. It's a very difficult, because no matter what you come up with, the other side will turn it down. Probably less the Israelis, because they are stronger also. But like you said, on the Palestinian side, it's extremely complicated because they don't, in addition, they do not speak with one voice. So it's very difficult to know, even if Abbas tomorrow and the Palestinian Authority sits down with Israelis, like they did before. It didn't go anywhere, but they did before, under the previous administration anyway. John Kerry wasted 1 year of the shuttling diplomacy going to the Middle East from Jerusalem to Cairo and to Gaza and to no avail. After 1 year, he just gave up. How can you make sure that even if one faction of the Palestinians is willing to compromise to some extent, the extremity, the Hamas, which rejects the existence of Israel, what do you do with them? So when you don't speak with one voice, whom do you talk to? I have no answer. I'm just asking a question. I have absolutely, I don't know. I really don't know. And I'm not the only one. I mean, again, Israel has been around since 1948, and we haven't gotten any further down the road than we are in 1948, except that Israel's border had changed somewhat since 1948. But that's about it. Nothing has changed.
How are the Palestinians sustaining themselves now? I have the impression that their economy is horrible.
Well, it's mostly through international assistance. The United Nations, different agencies, in Gaza anyway. In the West Bank, the land is good. I mean, agriculture, basically agriculture and small businesses, small companies in the West Bank. Mm-hmm. And in Gaza, you're right, there is nothing. I mean, fishing, there's some fishery, but they cannot go too far from the coast. And basically international assistance. UNRWA, which is the United Nations Agency for Refugees, and NGOs and the European Union help them financially, because there are no natural resources to speak of in Gaza. It's somewhat different. The West Bank is better in that respect, and they even export agricultural products basically to the European Union. Europe is closer, so that's how they survive, and small companies.
Two thoughts. One is that I heard the ambassador to Israel talking and saying one of the things that they added to the agreement was that it was in force for 4 years, so that the Palestinians, if they chew on it and decide that they want to come to, the same beginning offer will be there. I
mentioned that to you. There is, it's not a question of 4-year transitional period, but for the next 4 years, Israel commits itself to freeze constructions of new Jewish settlements on the West Bank. Those are the 4 years, with the understanding that in between, I mean, during those 4 years, there will be some negotiations between the parties. So they would agree on where to build or where not to build, or if Israel wants to build new settlements, then it would have to give up some of the existing settlements, so the Palestinian state can still be. But however you look at it, it will never be, or at least as it is now, it would never be a contiguous state. And in addition, I think I mentioned that it will be a demilitarized state. In other words, they won't be allowed to have an army for the time being anyway, which might be 50 years or 30 years, or it all depends. So the Palestinian state in terms of military would be still under Israeli control, surrounded actually by Israel, as I mentioned, since Israel will have a presence on the Jordanian border along the Jordan River.
Did you mention that Oman and the Emirates were involved in putting this together?
Well, they consulted the Sunni states, yes, in the Gulf, by trying to explain to them, but they know it themselves. As I said earlier, the Palestinian issue today for the Arab states is not as important as it used to be a few years ago, because again, the political landscape has somewhat changed in the Middle East, and these countries, the Gulf countries anyway, do not consider Israel as a main threat to their existence. They worry much more about Iran, the Shiite threat, than Israel.
So wouldn't that add a little bit more pressure to coming to some solution?
For the Palestinians?
Yeah.
It should. It should, definitely, because Saudi assistance, financial assistance, it's not only Saudi, but the Emirates and Oman and Qatar, they send a lot of money to the Palestinians. So in itself, it should put pressure on the
That's a pretty
Palestinians to come to the table.
That's a pretty big change to having some.
But
other
first
countries
the
supporting it.
Palestinians have to change themselves. Within the Palestinian circles, and that's why Abbas, again, who's 84, he was Arafat's successor, is so challenged within the Palestinian circles. I'm not saying that his successor will be more flexible. It might not be the case, but I don't know. It might be the case that finally they decide that it is time, in which case they have to expect to have some kind of standoff and showdown with Hamas, because that issue, before anything, before you can come to the table and talk on behalf of the Palestinian people, you have to work out your internal differences and divisions. And even though Hamas and the Palestinian Authority met 50 times, 100 times, and claimed to be united and form a coalition government, it will never came to anything. So as long as the Hamas issue is not resolved for the Palestinian Authority, which, by the way, recognizes Israel as state, not so Hamas, but the Palestinian Authority does. For Israel to talk to whom? So basically, the precondition in a way is to work out some kind of either agreement or to work out the issue of Hamas in Gaza. And that militarily the Palestinian Authority cannot do. They are much weaker than Hamas. So that's an extra issue. No more. Wow, I thought there would be 100 million questions here on the Middle East and this particularly sensitive issue. But all right, yes. Yes. Now,
I'm done.
you're absolutely right to mention this. That's a very good point, which I didn't mention in my presentation. Now, you might remember this plan has two components. The political component, which actually should have been presented first, and then the economic incentive, so to speak, or the second component, which was presented first instead of being presented second. Why? Because, again, of the Israeli elections. Every time that the administration wanted to put out the plan with the both components, which makes sense, either at the same time or to present the political component before the economic component. As you know, these are the third elections to take place in Israel in March. So every time they waited for a new government to be formed in Jerusalem before presented the plan. And every time there was no resolution because the two parties came out tied. So there is a caretaker government in Jerusalem, but there is no government to really talk to. So there is uncertainty in that respect. So since the U.S. did not want to wait any longer, it put out the economic component first. That was back in October, when the U.S. organized an international conference in Bahrain, gathering a number of Arab countries and other countries around the peace plan, but nobody knew at the time what the peace plan was. So that's an issue when you have to commit yourself to support or not a peace plan that you haven't seen yet. But again, that was for because of the Israeli elections. So in October, the administration organized this meeting in Bahrain, where the Palestinians were offered $50 billion in case they came to the negotiating table with Israel. But again, the peace plan was not known. It's been only unveiled 10 days ago. But most of the money would be Arab money and not American money. But no decision was made at the time as to who would give, what donor country would give how much, because nobody knew what was in the plan. I'm not saying that they're going to hurry and sign up today to help the Palestinians either, but you're right, there was an economic, financial incentive, so to speak, for the Palestinians to accept to enter negotiations, which was basically around $50 billion to help them boost their economy or start their economy in the West Bank, in the future state, and in Gaza particularly. But again, now that the plan is known, well, let's see what happens financially. Again, the U.S. administration, which organized the meeting, but not in the U.S., in Bahrain, has not committed itself one way or the other in terms of numbers. The administration only said the money will come mostly from Arab from the Arab sources, oil producing countries. So that it remains to be seen how this can be worked out. Yes.
Do you know if Kuwait has been involved in any way in the
I don't know if Kuwait was really involved in I would say yes, because most of the Gulf countries, which again consider Iran as a real a threat, and Kuwait knows probably better than all the other Gulf countries what it means to be invaded. I guess that all this, all the Emirates in the area, both as allies of the United States and regional allies of Saudi Arabia, must have been consulted. The Kuwaiti ambassador was not in New York or in Washington when the announcement was made. Only Oman and Qatar sent their ambassadors from Arab countries. But I don't know for a fact whether Kuwait was involved. My feeling is that yes, they are involved, and definitely they will be involved if there is money involved. Yes.
Curious about the scale, the miles, the size of Israel. Is it true that it's only maybe 30 miles from the Mediterranean to the Jordan River? Or
No, but from Tel Aviv to the West Bank, yes, it's even. Well, from Tel Aviv
Yes.
to the West Bank, yes.
because that scale, oh, maybe I'm reading it wrong. But it says
No, you're looking
miles.
here to the West Bank. This is the West Bank.
Yes.
This is Israel proper.
Okay.
Okay.
But
So Tel Aviv is basically here somewhere. Okay. And Qalqilia is here. So I would say even less than 30 miles.
But I'm looking at the scale at the bottom of the map.
Yes.
It's like 10 miles.
Say that again. It's more like 11 or 12 miles than
To
that, sir.
the West Bank.
To the West Bank.
Right.
Yes.
And then to the Jordan. Okay. So it's a.
No,
like-
Jordan is here.
Yes, I know. The scale,
Jordan,
I'm just using
you're right.
that
Before
size.
the 1967 war, Jordan was here as well. Okay, so when you look at the map, obviously, I don't want to go all the way back, but what happened is that during the 67 war, Jordan was the last Arab country to get involved against Israel, and Israel had tried to warn Jordan not to really get involved. And there was so much pressure from the Arab peers, particularly Egypt and Syria, to attack Israel, because there was one coming from the south, the other one coming from the north. So there was so much pressure on Jordan that he couldn't resist the pressure, and he got involved. And obviously he lost the West Bank, and he lost East Jerusalem in this enterprise. But I don't know if Israel, but that's I suppose Israel would not have liberated or administered Jerusalem without the Jordanian implication in the war, because they definitely sent warnings to the Jordanian to stay out of it, but King Hussein just couldn't. There was too much pressure on him to help the Egyptians and the Syrians at the time.
Israel does not include the West
I said,
environmental?
well, Israel will include, again, the thinking was that Israel and the Palestinians would sit down at some point and work out some kind of solution whereby Israel will absorb a number of settlements which are on the border, on the existing border between Jordan, if you will, West Bank, and Israel proper, into Israel after this settlement, but would evacuate a number of settlements which were created in the past half century by Israel in the heart of the West Bank. So the Palestinians could have a contiguous state. So, because obviously the Jewish settlements are surrounded with some Israeli military presence, obviously for security reasons. So the idea was that to 85% of the settlers would become part of Israel, which are not for the time being. Those are territories for the international community anyway, which are administered by Israel, but they are not part of Israel proper. So the idea was for the Israelis to absorb some of the settlements which are close to their borders, and then evacuate a number of settlements which had been created in the heart of the West Bank, so that the Palestinians, number one, would have a contiguous country, and number two, to compensate for the settlements that Israel would absorb. That was the idea. And the Trump's peace plan changes all that. In other words, all the Israeli Jewish settlements created in the West Bank would stay under Israel's sovereignty, authority. And the area where there are no settlements would become the Palestinian state. So since it will not be contiguous, obviously, then you'll have a number of bridges and tunnels that would connect all those pieces between different parts of a future Palestinian state. That's the idea of the plan today. Yes. Sorry? Well, to answer your second question first, the influence of Iran, I guess, obviously, at least unofficially, they look into it and they try to help the Palestinians as much as they can. Now, how they can do it practically, they have their proxies. I mean, even though they've been focusing on arming lately Hezbollah in Lebanon, which has now really an army of 20,000 plus people up in Lebanon, and its political arm of Hamas is basically running Lebanon, politically speaking. Sorry? Hezbollah. I mean Hezbollah. They are running politically they're running the country based on a militia which is much stronger than the government, the Lebanese army. So, not to mention that they have all these outposts in the in southern Lebanon on the border with Israel. So Iran is definitely involved. In the peace plan, Iran has, at this point, has other concerns really than the peace plan between Palestinians and Israel. But you can, publicly at least, you can expect the Iranians to react adversely to the plan, and to even to try and help Hamas, even though Hamas is a Sunni militia and not Shiite militia. So they are definitely involved. Not to mention that, as you know, they have outposts now in Syria, and they're trying to build to build up their presence, military presence in Syria. As for your first question, barrier is here. So Abu Dis is on the other side of the barrier. If Abu Dis should ever become the capital of Israel, it's actually it's outside the barrier, but it's a neighborhood. It's a district of Jerusalem. It's part of Jerusalem administratively, but placed outside the barrier, which cuts it off from Al-Aqsa and this area. So obviously there are something like 11 gates which give access to the old city in Jerusalem, something like that, 11 gates. Some of them are reserved only for the Muslim residents of Jerusalem to come and pray there. And only one is open to the other faces. I'm not quite sure, but something like that. Most of the gates in the old city leading to this holy basin are reserved for the Muslims, for praying there, and only one or two are for the Christians and Jews. So you can tell that Abu Dis is outside and it's also cut off from the 300,000 people who live in Jerusalem, the Arab Palestinians who live in Jerusalem. So how can you create a capital in a place which is cut off from the rest of the country unless the barrier will come down at some point? That is also a possibility, but then that also needs to be negotiated. Will Israel will take down the barrier if its security is assured somehow. But how that can be done and how long it takes, because it would be done gradually. Obviously, it won't be done overnight. It's not like the Berlin Wall that will come down from one day to next. And that's why I said that this religious component makes things much more complicated. With Germany, it was, the wall dividing the communist regime from Western Germany, from Eastern Germany. But basically you dealt with Germans on both sides who went from one political system to a different one. That was relatively easy to do. In this particular case, good luck. Say that again? No, absolutely. I'm not discussing now the reason for the wall. I'm just saying that if a capital is established there, at some point you cannot keep that place out of reach with the residents on the other side. You're supposed to be ruling over 300,000 Palestinians in Jerusalem. But if you cannot have access to them, or you can have access to them through the wall, yeah, it should be. But again, I don't know. You build a bridge or a tunnel, or and not even for this, the peace plan, as I told you. To make up for the land that the Jewish settlements take up on the West Bank, the plan suggests these areas to be given to the Palestinians on the border with Egypt. And even from here to reach the new state of Palestine eventually, the plan suggests a tunnel going through here. It should be that, I mean, it's a 30-40 mile tunnel going from what would be Palestine into and from Gaza also. If Gaza one day is ruled by the Palestinian Authority and no longer by Hamas, Gaza would become part of a Palestinian state. But again, this is Israel. So how do you get to the rest of Palestine? Tunnel. Would that be accepted by the Palestinians? Good question. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. The Gaza question and the West Bank, it's also always been an issue, because geographically speaking, if Gaza becomes part of the Palestinian state, how do you go from Gaza to the West Bank and through Israel? So it would have to be a tunnel. But then again, you'd have other tunnels here on the border with Egypt. So, yes. Don't speculate, because we have enough issues as it is when we're dealing with reality, you know. Yes. Yes, yes. Well, that I don't know. I think that the whole of the West Bank is relatively fertile. I mean, the land is very good, and it's not like Israel would give the Palestinians. But there is a reason also why, obviously, Israel created those settlements where they did, because, like you said, probably. They are created on good land, agriculturally speaking. But I'm not saying that they will give necessarily all the bad stuff to the Palestinians and keep only the good ones. They created them not so much based on economic grounds. They created them based on security grounds mostly, more than economic. So it's see how much, to what extent Israel would feel secure enough to give back some of the settlements to the Palestinians? How secure would they feel? So I'm leaving you with more questions than answers this time, but I really don't have any answers to give. This is a very, very complicated emotional issue. So, and it's been only 75 years. So when you look at it, you say it's been a long conflict. But in the larger scheme of things, 75 years in history, particularly this area of the world, is nothing. So I don't know. We should say in our lifetime, actually, because I don't know if we're going to see any satisfactory solution in our lifetime. We'll see what happens. So next time, well, not next week, but 2 weeks from now, we'll move on to an easier subject. An easier subject. I don't know what it is yet, but it will be definitely easier than this one. Thank you.